For decades, country music has quietly buried some of its biggest names, not because they died, but because the industry moved on. Over time, silence replaced headlines, and absence slowly turned into assumption. Many fans truly believe these legends are long gone, but the truth is far stranger. In this video, we revisit 10 country icons the world assumed were dead, only to discover they're still alive, watching their own legacy fade from the shadows. For a long time, many country fans quietly assumed Gene Watson was gone. His name stopped appearing in headlines, his songs faded from radio rotations, and newer generations barely heard him mentioned at all. In an industry that equates visibility with existence, silence often feels like death. And for Gene Watson, that silence lasted decades. At his peak in the 1970s and early 1980s, Watson was one of the purest voices in traditional country music. Songs like Love in the Hot Afternoon and 14 Karat Mind weren't crossover hits designed for pop charts. They were slow, aching, unapologetically country. Nashville respected him, fans trusted him, and critics knew exactly what he represented. But respect, as it turned out, didn't guarantee longevity. As country music shifted toward a slicker, more commercial sound, Watson refused to follow. He didn't reinvent himself, didn't chase trends, and didn't dilute his style to stay relevant. That decision came at a cost. Radio stopped calling, labels stopped pushing. The industry quietly moved on, leaving Watson behind without any formal goodbye. There was no scandal, no dramatic fall, just absence. Over time, that absence created a dangerous illusion. Fans who grew up with his music began to assume the worst. Without interviews, television appearances, or viral moments, Gene Watson slowly vanished from the public imagination. Many genuinely believed he had passed away years earlier. In reality, he had simply stepped out of the spotlight that no longer wanted him. What makes Watson's story especially haunting is that he never truly disappeared. He continued recording albums, touring smaller venues, and performing for audiences who still cared deeply about traditional country. He lived, worked, and sang while the world stopped paying attention. In an industry obsessed with youth and reinvention, quiet persistence became indistinguishable from invisibility. Today, Gene Watson is still alive, still respected by musicians who know the history, and still performing when his health allows. Yet, his name remains absent from mainstream conversations about country legends. His story exposes a harsh truth at the heart of Nashville. You don't have to die to be erased. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to change. Mo Bandy. For many listeners, Mo Bandy feels like someone who belongs entirely to the past. His name evokes jukeboxes, neon-lit honky-tonks, and an era of country music that no longer exists on mainstream radio. Over the years, as his presence faded from public view, a quiet assumption settled in among fans: Mo Bandy must be gone. In reality, like many traditional country artists, he simply outlived the spotlight that once depended on him. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Mo Bandy was impossible to ignore. He embodied honky-tonk country at a time when authenticity still mattered. Songs about heartbreak, drinking, and regret weren't marketing strategies for him. They were reflections of real lives, sung without polish or irony. His duets with Joe Stampley became staples of the genre, and his solo hits filled dance floors across the country. For a while, Mo Bandy wasn't just successful. He was essential. But as Nashville's priorities shifted, artists like Bandy found themselves increasingly out of place. The industry began favoring crossover appeal, smoother production, and younger faces. Mo Bandy didn't fit the new image, and more importantly, he didn't try to. He stayed loyal to honky-tonk, believing that country music didn't need to evolve at the cost of its soul. That loyalty, however, came with consequences. Radio airplay dried up. Major labels lost interest. Television appearances stopped. There was no scandal, no dramatic collapse, just a gradual disappearance. As years passed, Mo Bandy's name became something people remembered vaguely rather than followed actively. For many casual fans, the absence was so complete that it turned into assumption. If no one is talking about him, surely he must be dead. The truth is far less dramatic and far more revealing. Mo Bandy continued to perform, record, and tour, often in smaller venues, for audiences who never stopped appreciating what he represented. He didn't vanish. He was simply pushed to the margins of an industry that no longer valued what he stood for. In a business obsessed with novelty, tradition became invisible. Today, Mo Bandy is still alive, still singing, and still recognized by those who understand country music's roots. Yet his story highlights an uncomfortable reality. Survival doesn't guarantee remembrance. You can live on, creating and performing, while the world quietly moves forward without you. In country music, being forgotten can feel almost the same as being gone. T.G. Sheppard. For a surprising number of country fans, T.G. Sheppard exists only as a distant memory, a voice from an old record collection, a name half remembered from late-night radio decades ago. As his presence faded from the spotlight, many quietly assumed the inevitable, that he must have passed away. The truth, however, is far more unsettling. T.G. Sheppard didn't die. He was simply left behind. At his height in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Sheppard was everywhere. He wasn't just successful, he was dominant. With a string of chart-topping hits and sold-out tours, he represented a polished, confident version of country music that still honored its roots. His songs crossed boundaries without betraying the genre, making him one of Nashville's most reliable stars. For a time, T.G. Sheppard was exactly what country music looked like. But success in Nashville is often temporary, especially when the industry's identity shifts. As country music began chasing younger audiences and pop influence, Sheppard's smooth, traditional sound suddenly felt outdated to executives chasing trends. He didn't implode. He didn't embarrass himself. He simply aged. And in country music, aging without reinvention can be fatal to visibility. As radio programmers replaced familiarity with novelty, Sheppard's airplay vanished. Television appearances became rare. The industry that once promoted him relentlessly stopped returning calls. Over time, the silence became complete. Newer generations of fans grew up without hearing his name at all, while older listeners assumed that the lack of news meant he was gone for good. What makes Sheppard's story especially painful is that he never stopped being an artist. He continued performing, recording, and connecting with fans who still remembered what he once represented. He maintained a quiet, dignified career far from the center of Nashville's attention. But dignity doesn't generate headlines, and consistency doesn't trend online. Slowly, existence without exposure turned into erasure. Today, T.G. Sheppard is still alive, still respected by musicians who lived through his era, and still performing when given the chance. Yet his absence from mainstream conversation reveals a brutal truth about the country music machine. You can have hits, influence, and longevity, and still be written out of history while you're breathing. His story isn't about failure. It's about how quickly the industry forgets those who no longer serve its image. In country music, fame doesn't fade with a bang. Sometimes it just quietly stops being acknowledged. Shah, Janie Fricke. For many country fans, Janie Fricke feels like a voice that belongs to a closed chapter. Her songs still surface on classic playlists, but her name rarely appears in conversations about living legends. Over time, that absence has led many listeners to a quiet conclusion. Surely, she must be gone by now. In reality, Janie Fricke didn't disappear because she died. She disappeared because the industry stopped looking back. In the early 1980s, Fricke was one of the most recognizable female voices in country music. Her sound was unmistakable, soft, emotional, and perfectly tuned to the era's appetite for heartfelt ballads. With multiple #1 hits and major awards, she wasn't a background figure or a passing trend. She was a central presence on country radio, a familiar face on television, and a symbol of Nashville's polished mainstream success. But as the decade closed, the landscape around her began to change. Country music moved away from orchestral ballads and toward a harder, more image-driven sound. Younger artists arrived with new aesthetics, and female singers were increasingly pushed into narrower roles. Fricke didn't crash or self-destruct. She simply found herself out of sync with what Nashville wanted to sell next. The industry's withdrawal was subtle but decisive. Radio spins slowed, promotional support vanished, and her visibility faded almost overnight. Without scandal or controversy to keep her name circulating, Janie Fricke slipped quietly out of the public eye. For fans who had once heard her voice everywhere, the silence felt final. Years passed, and many assumed the story had ended entirely. What makes Fricke's disappearance particularly revealing is that she never truly left music behind. She continued performing, recording, and engaging with audiences who still valued her work. She chose a quieter path, away from the relentless cycle of reinvention demanded by the mainstream. But in an industry driven by constant exposure, stepping back is often indistinguishable from vanishing. Today, Janie Fricke is still alive, still respected by those who understand her impact, and still remembered by fans who lived through her peak years. Yet she remains largely absent from modern narratives about country music's history. Her story highlights a painful reality. For women in country music especially, longevity doesn't guarantee recognition. Janie Fricke didn't fade because she lacked talent or relevance. She faded because the industry moved forward without making room for her to remain visible. And once that visibility is gone, even living legends can be mistaken for ghosts. Ronnie Milsap. For many country fans today, Ronnie Milsap feels like a name frozen in time. His songs still echo on classic stations, but his presence in the modern country conversation has all but vanished. Over the years, that silence has led many listeners to quietly assume he must no longer be alive. The reality is far more unsettling. Ronnie Milsap didn't disappear because he died. He disappeared because the industry stopped knowing what to do with him. At his peak, Milsap was one of the most successful artists country music had ever seen. Blind from birth, he overcame obstacles few could imagine and built a career defined by crossover dominance. His music blurred the lines between country, pop, and soul without losing its emotional core. He wasn't just respected, he was unavoidable. Radio loved him, labels trusted him, and audiences followed him across genres. But the very versatility that once made Milsap indispensable eventually worked against him. As country music became increasingly image-driven and youth-focused, artists who didn't fit neatly into a marketable category were quietly sidelined. Milsap wasn't rebellious. He wasn't controversial. He simply represented an era Nashville was eager to move past. And once the industry's attention shifted, it never truly returned. As the years passed, his radio presence dwindled. Television appearances became rare. His name stopped appearing in retrospectives aimed at younger audiences. For fans who hadn't followed his career closely, the absence created a false conclusion. When someone so important is no longer discussed, people assume the story must be over. What makes Milsap's story especially painful is that he never stopped being an artist. He continued recording, performing, and connecting with fans who understood his legacy. Yet his later years unfolded mostly outside the spotlight, in a world where relevance is measured by constant exposure. Without headlines, even monumental achievements begin to fade from public memory. Today, Ronnie Milsap is still alive, still honored by musicians who recognize his influence, and still admired by those who understand the depth of his catalog. But his marginalization reveals a harsh truth about the country music industry. Once an artist no longer fits the narrative of the moment, history itself becomes selective. Milsap's story isn't about decline or failure. It's about how easily greatness can be archived and forgotten while the person behind it is still breathing. In country music, silence doesn't just erase careers. It rewrites reality. For many casual country listeners, Jeannie Seely feels like a name pulled from a distant past. A voice associated with black and white television, old Grand Ole Opry footage, and an era that seems permanently sealed off. As the years passed and her presence outside traditional circles diminished, a quiet assumption took hold. She must have died long ago. But Jeannie Seely didn't disappear because her life ended. She disappeared because the world stopped paying attention. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Seely was anything but forgettable. She broke through at a time when female country artists were expected to stay within narrow boundaries. Her voice carried both vulnerability and defiance, and her success wasn't accidental. She earned her place through hit records, constant touring, and a reputation for authenticity that resonated deeply with audiences. She wasn't a novelty. She was a fixture. Yet even at her peak, Seely occupied a precarious position. Country music's treatment of women has always been conditional, and longevity for female artists was rarely encouraged. As new trends emerged and younger faces took center stage, Seely's visibility declined. The industry didn't reject her outright. It simply stopped amplifying her. And in Nashville, silence is often more final than rejection. Over time, her name retreated into niche spaces, Opry stages, legacy performances, and conversations among devoted fans. Outside those circles, she ceased to exist in the public imagination. For audiences who once saw her regularly, the absence felt definitive. Many assumed she had passed away, unaware that she was still actively involved in the very institution that defined her career. What makes Jeannie Seeley's story especially striking is that she never truly left. She remained one of the most consistent presences at the Grand Ole Opry, continuing to perform long after her contemporaries vanished. She lived inside the tradition that modern country increasingly treats as a relic. But tradition, without promotion, doesn't translate into visibility. In a culture obsessed with reinvention and relevance, Seeley's steady presence worked against her. There were no dramatic comebacks, no viral rediscoveries, no headline-grabbing scandals, just continuity. And continuity doesn't trend. As a result, an artist who helped shape country music's identity became nearly invisible to the generations that followed. Today, Jeannie Seeley is still alive, still respected by those who understand her contribution, and still performing when given the chance. Yet her story exposes a harsh reality. You can remain loyal to the heart of country music and still be mistaken for a footnote. In this industry, being alive doesn't guarantee being remembered. For many listeners, Crystal Gayle exists in a strange in-between space, famous enough to feel historic, yet absent enough to seem gone. Over the years, countless fans have quietly assumed she must have passed away, often confusing her fate with others from her era. The truth is more revealing than any rumor. Crystal Gayle didn't die. She simply slipped out of an industry that no longer knew how to frame her. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Gayle was one of country music's most recognizable stars. With her unmistakable voice and signature long hair, she represented a softer, more polished side of the genre. Songs like Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue crossed borders, reaching audiences far beyond traditional country fans. She wasn't just successful, she was global. Awards, chart dominance, and constant media presence defined her peak years. But Crystal Gayle's success also came with an invisible ceiling. As trends shifted and Nashville chased younger, louder, more image-driven artists, her refined style began to feel out of step with the moment. She didn't implode or fall from grace. Instead, the spotlight slowly dimmed. Her music remained respected, but no longer prioritized. And without constant exposure, even icons begin to fade. Adding to the confusion was her famous family connection. As the younger sister of Loretta Lynn, many fans subconsciously grouped their stories together. When Loretta's health struggles and eventual passing dominated headlines, a false narrative quietly formed around Crystal as well. Time blurred facts, and silence filled the gaps. For casual observers, it became easier to assume Crystal Gayle was gone than to wonder why she wasn't being talked about. What makes her story especially telling is that she never truly left music behind. She continued to perform, tour internationally, and record on her own terms. She chose distance from Nashville's machinery rather than chasing relevance at any cost. But in a culture that equates success with visibility, choosing privacy often reads as disappearance. Over the decades, Crystal Gayle became a living reminder of how quickly fame can be archived. New generations discovered her songs without knowing the woman behind them was still alive. Legacy replaced presence. History replaced reality. Today, Crystal Gayle is still alive, still admired by musicians who understand her influence, and still remembered fondly by those who grew up with her voice. Yet her near erasure from mainstream conversation reveals a hard truth. In country music, stepping away doesn't just end a chapter. It allows others to rewrite the ending entirely. For many country fans, Tanya Tucker feels like someone whose story already ended years ago. Her name is tied so tightly to the past that silence around her created a powerful illusion that she must be gone. The truth is more complicated and far more uncomfortable. Tanya Tucker didn't die. She survived something that often looks similar from the outside, being slowly erased while still alive. Tucker's rise was unlike almost anyone else's in country music. She became a star as a teenager, her voice carrying an emotional weight that felt far older than her years. By the time most artists were still trying to get noticed, she was already a household name. Fame came fast, overwhelming, and without the protections adults usually build for themselves. Nashville celebrated her success, but it never truly prepared her for what came after. As she grew older, the industry's relationship with her changed. The same world that had embraced her youth became far less forgiving of her adulthood. Personal struggles, relentless scrutiny, and a refusal to conform to neat expectations pushed her into an uneasy space. She was too famous to disappear completely, yet too unpredictable for an industry obsessed with control. Instead of support, she was met with distance. Over time, Tucker's visibility faded. Radio airplay slowed. Media attention became sporadic. For long stretches, her name surfaced only in nostalgic references to her early hits. To casual observers, it looked like a familiar ending. Another country star burned out and vanished. Many quietly assumed the worst, believing that the chaos of her past must have caught up with her. But Tanya Tucker never stopped existing, and she never fully stopped creating. She lived outside Nashville's expectations, stepping away from the constant churn of relevance. When she returned with new music years later, it wasn't framed as the continuation of a career, but as a surprising resurrection, as if she had come back from the dead rather than simply endured. That framing reveals the real issue. In country music, prolonged absence is treated as an ending. If an artist doesn't maintain visibility, their life story is assumed to be complete. Tucker's decades of silence weren't seen as survival. They were interpreted as disappearance. Today, Tanya Tucker is still alive, still recording, and still commanding respect from those who understand what she endured. Yet the assumption of her absence lingers, especially among fans who lost track of her long ago. Her story exposes a harsh truth about fame in country music. When the industry stops telling your story, the world assumes it's over. Even if you're still standing. Tanya Tucker didn't outlive her talent. She outlived the version of the industry that knew what to do with her. And for many legends, that kind of survival is the hardest one to explain. For many people, Lee Greenwood exists as a single frozen image in time. His name is inseparable from one iconic song, endlessly replayed during national moments, ceremonies, and televised tributes. Outside of that context, however, Greenwood himself has nearly vanished from public consciousness. Over the years, this strange form of visibility without presence has led many fans to quietly assume that he must be gone. After all, when someone is reduced to a symbol, the person behind it often disappears. In the early 1980s, Greenwood was far more than a one-song legacy. He was a consistent hitmaker, a polished performer, and a reliable figure on country radio. His music blended traditional country with adult contemporary sensibilities, making him accessible without abandoning the genre. At his peak, he wasn't a novelty act or a political symbol. He was simply a successful country artist with a clear identity and a strong following. But over time, that identity narrowed. As the industry evolved and new generations took over the spotlight, Greenwood's broader catalog quietly faded from rotation. His career became defined almost entirely by a single moment rather than a body of work. While that song ensured his name would never fully disappear, it also trapped him in a very specific role. The industry no longer presented him as a living, evolving artist, but as a reminder of something already concluded. As years passed, Greenwood's absence from mainstream country conversation became more pronounced. He wasn't featured in discussions about genre evolution, rarely appeared in retrospectives aimed at younger audiences, and slowly drifted out of public awareness beyond ceremonial appearances. For casual fans who remembered him vividly decades earlier, the silence felt final. Many assumed his story had ended altogether. What makes Greenwood's case especially revealing is that he never truly left. He continued performing, touring, and engaging with audiences, particularly those who connected with the themes that made him famous. Yet his ongoing life and career existed almost entirely outside the narrative framework of modern country music. Without constant media reinforcement, his continued existence became invisible to a public trained to equate relevance with presence. In a strange way, Greenwood was neither fully remembered nor fully forgotten. He became a symbol rather than a person, a song rather than a story. And once an artist is reduced to that, the human reality behind the name is easily overlooked. Today, Lee Greenwood is still alive, still active, and still recognized in specific contexts. But his near erasure as a living country artist highlights a subtle cruelty of fame. When an industry decides your story is finished, it stops checking whether you're still here at all, and eventually the audience follows its lead. For many country fans, Lorrie Morgan feels like someone who quietly slipped out of time. Her voice once dominated radio, her face filled television screens, and her name carried emotional weight throughout the 1990s. Then, almost without warning, the noise stopped. Over the years, that silence hardened into assumption. For a surprising number of listeners, Lori Morgan became someone they believed was no longer alive. At her peak, Morgan was one of the most successful female artists in modern country music. She didn't just have hits, she had an identity. Her songs were vulnerable, dramatic, and unapologetically emotional, often reflecting heartbreak with a level of honesty that resonated deeply with audiences. She wasn't riding trends, she was shaping the sound of her era, especially for women trying to maintain relevance in a genre that rarely offered long careers to female voices. But the country music industry has always been unforgiving when it comes to longevity, particularly for women. As the sound of country shifted and younger artists arrived with carefully packaged images, Morgan's place became increasingly unstable. Personal tragedy compounded the problem. Loss, public scrutiny, and emotional strain followed her relentlessly, and instead of support, the industry slowly stepped back. Her life became a headline, while her music faded into the background. As radio moved on and labels redirected attention elsewhere, Morgan's visibility collapsed. She didn't vanish overnight. She was gradually pushed to the margins. Without constant media presence, her name stopped circulating. For casual fans who remembered her vividly, the absence felt conclusive. Years passed without major headlines, and many assumed her story had ended in the most literal sense. What makes Morgan's story particularly revealing is that she never truly stopped being an artist. She continued touring, recording, and performing, often for audiences who remained fiercely loyal. But her career existed outside the mainstream narrative that defines who is considered still relevant. In an industry obsessed with youth and reinvention, survival without transformation is often mistaken for disappearance. Lori Morgan lived through something more subtle than a downfall. She lived through neglect. The industry didn't destroy her career with scandal or rejection. It simply stopped paying attention. And once attention is gone, memory follows quickly behind. Today, Lori Morgan is still alive, still performing, and still carrying a legacy that many have forgotten how to acknowledge. Her story exposes a harsh truth about country music. You don't have to die to be mourned. Sometimes you're mourned simply because no one remembers to check if you're still here.